U.S. President Donald Trump and former Vice President Joe Biden are set to go head-to-head in their last scheduled debate this Thursday. With their first encounter marred with constant interruptions, this time the two candidates will have their microphones muted to allow the other to speak without pause. The decision was made after the White House physician's announcement that Mr. Trump tested negative for COVID-19 10 days after he contracted the coronavirus. With 2 weeks to go until election, after some 27 million Americans have already voted, both men are pushing to capture swing states and galvanize last-minute support. So what can we expect from their final face-off? Will hot-button issues such as race, law and order, and the pandemic still take center stage? Time to bring in our panelists. For the final presidential debate, we are joined by our strong panel. Bruce Fein, former Associate Deputy Attorney General and General Counsel of the Federal Communications Commission under President Reagan. In Washington, D.C., Todd Belt, Professor and Political Management Program Director at George Washington University. Last but not least, in Iowa City, Timothy Hagel, Professor of Political Science at University of Iowa. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Only a few weeks to go before the election, so the third debate, which now of course become the second debate, becoming such an eye-catching event. So what can we really expect, Professor Hagel?
The new rule is that there will be an uninterrupted 2 minutes for each candidate to give an opening statement on each particular topic, and the moderator has the ability to mute the microphone of the other candidate if need be. And so that way you won't have the interruptions that we saw in the last debate. So that's one structural change that's different. We'll have to wait and see whether or not the candidates are able to stick to that, whether there's interactions in the open discussion portion, or whether the candidates will be able to get their points across, or if they're going to be interrupted. And hopefully we'll get some good information and they will behave themselves, so to speak.
Professor Belt, is there much hope that the candidates might be able to behave themselves, quote unquote?
The debate commission is really doing all it can to do that. With like what Professor Hagel said about the 2-minute uninterrupted muting of the microphones are really important. Also, another new rule that was put in is that any time that is taken up with interruptions will be given back to the person who was interrupted. And so that means that we might get some more policy discussion coming out of this debate than we've seen in the past.
I'm sure the word interruption will be up to interpretation, I'm sure, during the process of the debate. But Mr. Fein, from the legal perspective, how do you see the changes of the rules of the debate? One of the most important political events, the election, leading up to the election.
Well, surely the host of the debate is entitled to prescribe the rules. The candidates are not required to participate, indeed. On the previous debate, Mr. Trump, because he didn't like the rule regarding COVID-19, pulled out. So there's nothing legally that's flawed about the commission altering the rules in the name of civility. I'm less optimistic than the previous commentators. I do not think Mr. Trump, despite any kind of rule change, is able to resist name-calling, degradation, screaming, yelling, COVID-19 crazy, Dr. Fauci, saying Joe Biden and his son should go to jail, things of that sort. I think that's the way he's campaigned outside the debate context, and I don't see any change within it. Mr. Biden is a little more civilized, but he also can be provoked. But despite the rule changes, I think the narrative still will be largely the same without the interruptions that we witnessed at the first debate.
Well, you know, gentlemen, for people outside the United States, it really doesn't matter how your presidential debate, for the candidates are likely to be carried out. But people do care what these candidates have to say in terms of what kind of America they aspire once they serve as the leadership of the country. We know the election, there are already early voting. Mail voting also has become a controversial issue. So how do you see, Mr. Fein, the Supreme Court fight in terms of the candidates for the Supreme Court justice and vis-a-vis the debate going on with the early voting, the result of the voting, what can we see?
Well, we've already had a couple of excursions to the United States Supreme Court already with 8 justices. Most recently, just yesterday on Monday, the court voted 4-4 not to disturb a ruling of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court requiring that mail ballots be accepted as long as they're received 3 days after November 3rd, Election Day, unless there's definitive proof that they weren't mailed until after Election Day. It was controversial, but the states are largely in control of the method of selecting electors for the president. Other than instances of discrimination, the federal government basically is on the sidelines. And the Supreme Court here, as in other cases, typically defers to the states in deciding their own methods for counting votes for presidential electors. But in a previous case, I believe it was from South Carolina, the court did intercede and said that a federal judge was wrong to strike a witness requirement that was thought to be burdensome to voters unduly and suppress the right to vote, and said other than ballots that didn't have signatures that had been received at the time the court ruled, future ballots would have to have signatures. So right now, with an 8-8, a balanced court with Chief Justice Roberts siding reasonably regularly with the more liberal members, I think that these issues will be fought out state by state. Amy Coney, I believe that when she's confirmed, would clearly vote with the conservatives, but I don't think her confirmation will be in time to affect the election disputes that will arise out of November 3rd. That could change if there's something like a Bush v. Gore situation, but that's not probable.
Professor Belt?
Yeah, I think that this is going to get really interesting, the issue of the Supreme Court perhaps getting involved. I do expect Amy Coney Barrett to be confirmed and placed on the court before the election. It looks like the majority leader is really intent on doing that. And this debate, I think it's going to be really important. If we look back at what happened in the first debate, Donald Trump did get Joe Biden off his game a little bit by the harassing and the frequent interruptions, 128 interruptions during that debate. And I think that if there are a few less interruptions, we might get a little bit more policy information out of Joe Biden at least. We certainly will get the criticisms and the name calling out of President Trump.
Professor Hagel, about that too.
Well, you had mentioned the issue of the mail-in ballots and the Supreme Court and so forth, and as was indicated, it's probably going to be fairly interesting. Different states are going to have different problems. Smaller states like mine and here in Iowa, we're probably going to be okay, even with a large percentage of mail-in ballots, but some of the larger states, when they have just huge numbers of early and mail-in voting, that it could be that they're going to be engaged in a lengthy counting process. And there is a timetable that must be observed, and it was indicated if somehow that time period is exceeded, then you get into almost a Bush versus Gore situation where the Supreme Court may have to step in to make sure that the electors for each state are determined before the required time. Whether or not Amy Coney Barrett will participate is an open question. I agree that she'll probably be on the court. Apparently a vote is set for October 26th. We'll see if that actually happens.
Very interesting situation. Another thing we've been hearing over the past few days is the Trump appointed national security official suggesting the result of the election might not be able to come out on the election night. He suggested that it's not because there's no result, but rather there's extra so-called national security measures taken place. So, Mr. Fine, who will have a final say about the deadline, and how is the American political structure built in order to make sure the nuances only remain nuances, not necessarily going to disturb the final result?
Well, some questions can be answered, but some really would be novel.
Tell me more about that.
First of all, the states will decide, even though the statute has set November 3rd as the voting date, that doesn't prescribe the time for actually counting the votes. That is still a matter for the states. There are deadlines, but they're pretty lax as when state electors are supposed to gather in Washington votes in the Congress for one candidate or the other. So we're going to have 50 separate state rules on how swiftly votes will be counted after November 3rd. And as they say, some states permit ballots to be received after that date as long as they're believed to be postmarked on or before that date. Now we've come into some relatively novel territory. If we end up with competing slates of state electors, where, for instance, a state governor and the legislature are at odds, the Secretary of State may be at odds with the governor, where the Secretary of State is independent, and you could have one state in which both Biden electors and Trump electors claimed legitimacy. Where that happened previously in 1876 with 3 states, Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina, the Congress created an electoral commission composed of 15 members who decided which electors were valid. But that's not binding on any future Congress. We don't know how competing state electors would be resolved. So there are a lot of uncertainties out there, and I say it's compounded because we basically have 50 state separate electoral races rather than one unified race at the national level.
Professor Belt, you have a very interesting election in your country, and at least one of the candidates is very unique if you look at the presidential history. So the question really is, what are some of the legal possibilities that the 2 candidates could resort to in terms of their questioning about the result and the voting?
Well, I certainly think that you're right that the president has exerted a lot of power in terms of trying to influence public opinion regarding the validity of the election, and I think that is concerning. We pride ourselves in this country about having a peaceful transition of power, that we don't question what the states are doing that much in terms of how they count their votes. Most candidates are usually okay with that. But in terms of your question of what might happen, what could happen, that's a really open-ended one. I mean, we can look at what happened in 2000, and we see, that the Bush campaign, they filed suit in Florida to say that George Bush had standing, that his rights were violated in that state, and it went up through the state court system, and then the federal court, the Supreme Court got involved in that. Now, that doesn't have to happen this way. So it could go a number of ways. There's already dozens of cases that are already pending before, that may be coming before the Supreme Court, and they may try to go that route instead of going through the Supreme Court. Both sides are really getting as many lawyers as they can on the ball right now. They're raising money for post-election legal fees. So we know that a lot is in the works, and so we know that lawyers are very crafty in trying to find places where they can question what's going on. So the problem is, the longer this gets drawn out, if we don't know on election night for certain that we've got a definitive winner, then that really creates a lot more questions in the minds of the public that are already there because of the president, and questions that need to be resolved by the legal system.
Yeah. Another thing that is even more important is what the 2 candidates are for. For the concrete issues, whether it's trade, economy, COVID-19, strategic policies, multilateral interactions, and the future of the United States, where do you think the voters will be able to learn and be able to make their sound judgment?
The #1 issue for people still is COVID. That's far and away the #1 issue, and not too far behind it is the economy and the recession that we've been in because of COVID, largely because of COVID. And certainly on the issue of COVID, people trust Joe Biden much more than they trust President Trump, and it's in strong double digits. he's far and away ahead there. So the fact that the president had COVID actually puts it on the public agenda even more so, even though he's trying to say that he was strong and he conquered it and he thinks he's immune now. That still causes people to think about that issue. People are thinking about this every time they leave their house. Of course, the economy is a big issue. The candidates are roughly neck and neck in terms of who people trust on that issue. Other issues that are further down the line, I mean, when you have these really crucial, what we call kitchen table issues, right? Yeah. Health and welfare, the economy, the other ones really get pushed aside. Other ones that may be very important, like climate change, like national security, like foreign policy, these issues really just don't rise to the top for voters when they're making their considerations. And you were talking about candidate A and candidate B. When we have an election like this, the challenger usually wants to make it a referendum on the incumbent. What they want to do is say, are you better off than you were 4 years ago under this person's leadership? Now they have 4 years in office. Before, Donald Trump could just say, you know, I'm going to do all these things. The other person hasn't been good for you. Take a chance on me. What do you have to lose? But now he's had 4 years to put it up, and he has, and for a lot of people, he hasn't been able to do that.
Professor Hagel?
Right, and I would follow up on the notion of the kitchen table issues. I always talk about this, that for the most part, the Democrats, registered voters that are Democrats are going to vote for Biden, the Republicans are going to vote for Trump. There's some crossover between the two, but it's usually those middle voters, and particularly in the swing states, that will make the decision, and those are the folks that care much more about the kitchen table issues rather than the political process stuff, which they tend to basically say, oh, that's just politics, it's just partisanship, and they don't tend to be as concerned about it. And for them, they're going to be looking at things like jobs, economy, and health care, and with health care comes how the COVID-19 pandemic has been handled. But there's also a tension between that and the economy, that people realize that, well, we need to get COVID pandemic under control, but on the other hand, the economy is suffering as a result, so there needs to be some sort of a balance there, and different states have approached it in different ways. And to a certain extent, President Trump, as the president, really has to let the states do their thing to a certain extent, but Biden's campaign has indicated that they think that Trump hasn't shown a sufficient leadership, and so that's where you get into the issue that Professor Bell was saying, in terms of Biden running against an incumbent who has a record. But on the other hand, Trump is also trying to tar Biden with some of the failures of the Obama administration. And so it's a little bit of an unusual type of situation because Biden isn't a complete outsider given his own tenure as vice president.
Mr. Fine?
I wouldn't disagree with anything the previous participants stated. I would say, nevertheless, that to the extent that international affairs does influence votes, President Trump's record is dismal. He promoted with lots of phantasmagoria, a rapprochement with North Korea. It's building more missiles, hasn't eliminated a single nuclear weapon. Kim Jong-un, I think, took Mr. Trump to the cleaners. He's expanded NATO when he was trying to suggest that he was removing or reducing the U.S. profile. Troops still in Afghanistan, troops still in Iraq. He pulls out of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action in Iran. Iran's now on its way to developing a closer degree of achievement of a nuclear weapon. He's alienated the Europeans for that reason. He pulled out of climate change. He pulled out of open skies agreement with Russia. He may try to save something with an 11th hour agreement on extending the current START treaty. He's antagonized China over the South China Sea, the Uyghurs, Hong Kong, Taiwan. So we have our worst relations with the Chinese, not only strategically, but with regard to the trade wars. I think his foreign policy, to any who followed it at all, have been a virtual disaster. But overall, I think Trump has taken the United States to a new low in terms of its ability to negotiate successfully, its interests abroad. And he is not at all, despite his claim that he was only going to be president of the United States, not the world.
About the exit poll. Now, for media people like us, a lot of us rely on the exit poll in order to report on the ongoing process of a presidential election and help to reach a certain conclusion about who might win the election. This year, many suggest the exit poll may not be reliable. To all of you seasoned observers, what do you make of these comments, and what do you think are the information and factors people should rely on observing the result of this presidential election? Professor Hagel.
You're right. There are always some questions about the accuracy of the exit polls and how good they are in terms of actually determining who won a particular state or who won the election overall. This year we have, of course, additional challenges. The pandemic in particular, that I think that there are going to be some people, even the people that voted in person, may be a little bit reluctant to talk to people and get close contact with the pollsters on election night. But the bigger problem is the large number of mail-in votes. And it's not clear exactly who those folks are going to be. And certainly the people that do the exit polls aren't going to know how the mail-in votes were cast until they actually see some results. And so again, going back to an earlier point, is that, again, Americans tend to be fairly impatient about these sorts of things, but this may be a time when they really need to not rely so much on exit polls and wait until they actually see real results from the various states.
Both candidates and their camps are working on every possibilities. President Trump, after claiming recovery already on his campaign trails and still showing in front of the public that he has recovered. And also, we see candidate Biden has been winning quite some ground in terms of early voting. At least that's according to the media report. So how do you see the next few weeks leading up to the election likely to have an impact on the final result?
You're right. President Trump is really taking what you said, recovery, is really how he's taken this, both his own personal recovery in his health, but also the economic recovery. He's going to tout the jobs numbers. He's going to tout the growth in the economy since we hit the pit in the recession. And he has also been conducting his campaign as if things have turned around. We are coming back. America is coming back to what it used to be, and we're turning the corner and things are fine. Joe Biden has run his campaign in exactly the opposite way, right? Taking the time off, taking no chances with very large gatherings. As the president loves those, Joe Biden has been very wary of those. And, this is also a message that things are not back to normal. Things are not as they used to be. And so I think that's really going to be important. We know from the political science literature that for people who make up their minds in the last week or two, it's often really the personal characteristics of the candidates that really are the deciding factor for that small sliver of people that still haven't made up their minds. And so each of these candidates is really going to be evaluated on the basis of the leadership qualities that they have. Do they care for people like me? Do they provide strong leadership? Are they moral? Do they care about the poor? Are they intelligent? These types of qualities are going to be really important. These are what we should look for on display in the final debate. And for Joe Biden in the final debate, with the big lead like you said he has, the main thing is don't mess up. And he may be able to cruise to victory at this point.